Hello there. My name is Jonathan Friedman, and you are listening to the FAQs podcast by EHN Canada. This is the show where we scour the internet for the most frequently asked questions about mental health and addiction and ask an expert for their answers to them. Today, it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce my special guest, Dr. Amanda Tobe. Amanda, how are you doing today?
I'm doing really well. How about you, Jonathan?
I am doing so great. Just to give the listeners a little bit of background about yourself, Dr. Amanda Tobe is passionate about helping professionals, leaders, and students to overcome performance anxiety and build fulfilling careers. She guides clients through their job search journey, infusing each step with values that align with their professional expectations. In addition, Amanda is the author of a 10-week public speaking group designed to help her members fear less and speak more. She is a solutions-oriented practitioner who is known for her ability to identify resources, invent activities, and even leverage technology to support her clients in reaching their career goals. Amanda earned her master's and PhD in industrial and organizational psychology from the University of Guelph and is a member of the College of Psychologists of Ontario. What a resume.
Thank you for sharing that. And I'm really excited to be here today and sharing with our listeners a lot more about public speaking anxiety because it's an area that I'm really passionate about and an area where I also experienced this anxiety as part of my own career story. So it's an area that my pain has now turned into my purpose. So I'm really excited to be here to share a bit more about not only the kind of the ways that I work with clients, but even infusing parts of the conversation with my own personal story and personal struggles with it in the past.
I love that. And can you tell the listeners a bit of background? Like, out of all the fields in the world, why did you end up in this field of mental health care?
I love that question. So what's really interesting is that when I did my master's and PhD, there was a paper the very first week of graduate school, and it wasn't even a focus of the paper, but somewhere buried in this paper was this concept called job interview anxiety. And immediately I was like, what is that? Like, I think I've experienced that. What is that all about? So what happened was I went to go find that paper, and there was very little research, Jonathan, at the time on job interview anxiety. And so I was really interested about it. And so when we started to publish on this topic, it was also really fascinating to see how like news outlets were picking up on it and we're really interested to learn more about it. So what I found though is that I was really keen on this area of research. And so I just naturally kind of fell into thinking about if I really want to expand this work that I'm doing to think about not just job interview anxiety, it kind of led naturally to public speaking anxiety. So it became something that started off as like a really organic part of like my field of research, but then kind of turned into something where I was like, I think that we can borrow all this research on job interview anxiety to even help people with public speaking anxiety.
I love that. And for all the listeners, I know I've mentioned this, I think, in a previous episode, but this is an area that I'm personally curious about because I personally really struggle with social anxiety and public speaking anxiety as well. So I'm really excited to learn lots with you today, Amanda.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about all the various parts to this with regards to the causes and kind of where to start by working through it. And I'm hoping we can touch on some of those areas here today too.
That's right into our first question, which is what are the primary causes of public speaking anxiety and what do you see? How do they manifest?
There's a number of personality and environmental factors, of course, that underlie public speaking anxiety. But what I really want to speak to is how public speaking anxiety is really the perfect storm of a number of core beliefs that people have that aren't serving them. So if we think about beliefs related to comparison, to judgment, to perfectionism, and a lot of these core beliefs, again, are like create a lot of extra pressure and stress for people. And that's how it also kind of creates this additional pressure and then can result in things like a fear of losing control. So for a lot of people, it kind of starts off as being afraid of what other people think of them. And then what also happens is that they end up kind of fearing those situations because they have an experience with public speaking that didn't go well. And then they're like, oh, that's going to happen to me every single time now. So it's kind of like this learned association that also happens. But so I guess a huge part of this is obviously there's personality variables, people that, for example, have more of type A personalities that tend to have more perfectionistic types of tendencies and personality characteristics. And obviously environmental, what I wanted to highlight there too was around cultural variables and socialization even, and how that also interplays here. But really, at the end of the day, what I'm really seeing is that it tends to be this perfect storm of core beliefs that is really kind of resulting in someone creating so much extra pressure and not being able to kind of regulate those emotions in the moment.
That's really interesting. So can we take a moment to discuss like something like perfection, being a perfectionist? How does that create fear around public speaking? That's somebody who probably spends a lot of time thinking about what they're going to do, what they're going to say, and they're so focused on perfection. How does that create anxiety? How does that create fear?
It's a lot to do with expectations. So, a big part of why this also exists as a fear for many people is because of the expectations that we put on ourselves. So, a lot of people who struggle with perfectionism set very high expectations, and specifically people with more public speaking anxiety will kind of believe. So, believe is an important word here because we're talking about core beliefs. So, they believe the audience has very high expectations of them, and they also believe that their capability to deliver on those expectations, they have concerns about meeting those expectations. So what ends up happening is that sometimes that they perceive a discrepancy, like there's a deficit. So they want me to perform up here. I'm not going to be able to meet those expectations, those standards. And so that's kind of what also results in that additional pressure and anxiety is around, you know what, I have to meet those expectations and I better perform or else. And it better go perfectly too. So a lot of people with public speaking anxiety also, they will tend to zero in on, especially my individuals who have more perfectionistic tendencies, they will tend to zero in on the one or two pieces of the presentation that didn't go well, or of a podcast recording that didn't go well, if they're off to a shaky start, things like that. So they don't look at the whole picture. They kind of focus on one part of it. And so it results in not just like the pre-public speaking anxiety experience, but even the post. And that's something I even wanted to highlight here today is just around, it's not just around the anxiety you experience in the moment or before, it's also after. And I have a lot of people that want to come work with me because it's like, I don't like how I'm talking to myself after I have a presentation and how critical I am of myself after. So it's not just the before and during piece.
So there could be the anticipatory anxiety, the anticipation of an upcoming presentation. But after, and I am certainly spending a lot of time in therapy on this one, it's all of the ruminating that happens after. Like I'm in a band, I played a show, and I had 9 songs. 8 of those songs I absolutely crushed. My stage presence was great. I was moving. I was doing complex techniques. But one song, one of my effects pedals just did not work when I hit it. And all of the music that I have really relied on that effect. And I was able to pivot. I was able to figure it out. But for literally over a month after the show, I was like, man, that show was garbage. I didn't play well. And then, you're talking, like I'm talking to my partner, I'm talking to my other bandmates, and they're saying, Jonathan, it was such a good show. And I'm like, but that one song, it was awful and it ruined the whole show for everybody. But really, that's just the rumination after.
It is. And I'm glad that you shared that experience because I think a lot of people can relate to it because we beat ourselves up for hours, days, months after these situations. And a lot of people, when they've had a public speaking situation that didn't go well, it's so vivid. They can recall it as if it happened yesterday. And I think a lot of us have these, again, back to expectations. So I think that there's a famous Shakespeare quote that says that, expectations are at the root of all heartache. And so for a lot of people, it's kind of when we have those expectations that things have to go perfectly. And I think that one of the things that is important to work on is learning self-compassion as a skill and being able to say, you know what, there was, even if that one part wasn't ideal, there was a lot of other things that did go well, or giving yourself self-compassion even for that day. Like, was there a lot that was happening that morning? Were you kind of like more scattered, even getting into the podcast, for example, today with you, or a presentation, whatever it is? It's just even giving yourself self-compassion because we're not going to be the same every single time that we perform or speak or present. And we're not robots. And so I think it's important to kind of be aware of where your expectations are at.
It's really interesting. I'm gonna do something that I've never done on the show, and I'm gonna swap up a question
Do
because
it. I'm here for it.
because I'm really curious. Like, how do we let go of perfection? And that's like a 5-word question that seems simple, but I imagine it's like that's something that takes a lot of time.
It is something that takes a lot of time, and it takes working on, like with everything, it takes really going to the core beliefs of what your expectations are going into a public speaking situation. And I think one of the things specifically with public speaking anxiety is, rather than making it about performance, about like how well did you perform and how well did you impress people, making it about things like, do they understand what I've said? What is the key message that I want to deliver here? So for me, that's one of my ways that I try to shift that perfectionism and focus on the self to what is the greater good here that I'm trying to do? Like what is the greater focus of this presentation today, so that it doesn't become about that person. So I just find that it almost like deflects some of that attention from the self and about being as perfect, and thinking about what is the value that I want to deliver here today? What do I want people to walk away with understanding about public speaking anxiety, for example, even differently than they would have coming into this episode?
Right. And like, are people there to see the perfect Jonathan or the perfect Dr. Tobe, or are they there to learn something from Jonathan or Dr. Tobe, right? Um, it's when people are signing up to go to a conference, they're usually, I imagine, not thinking, oh, cool, I'm going to see that person. They're perfect every time. That's not why they sign up.
I love that. And I think that humility can be this superpower that we can tap into to say it's okay if people see me stutter over a word, or if they see me lose my train of thought. I think it makes us more likable and more relatable just by showing all the parts to ourselves.
I love that. Let's pivot a little bit and talk a bit about practical strategies or techniques that you recommend for someone looking to overcome their public speaking anxiety. So, we spoke a little bit about self compassion and sort of the anticipation before, the rumination after, but what are some practical strategies or techniques that people can try?
This is a great question, and there's a lot of parts to this answer. So I'm going to try to do my best to condense it. Where I want to start, though, is really with some low hanging fruit. And the low hanging fruit would be things like just being aware of how much caffeine you've had before public speaking. And can't tell you how many people have said to me, like right off the bat, when I cut out my coffee the morning of my presentation, it just reduced the anxiety by 10% right there. Another low hanging fruit thing, it would be reducing use of technology before public speaking. So really trying to be off of emails and off of just the busyness of kind of the day. So a lot of people, I will have them actually arrive early, whether it's virtual or in person, arrive early at a meeting and make a point to connect with other people. So a lot of times we are buried into our phones, and what happens actually is that our breathing is a lot more shallow, and even our heart can be beating a little bit differently when we're on technology. So it can be helpful to actually be off of your phones. I can't also tell you how many of my clients have said like that one thing made such a huge difference. So I like low hanging fruit items. I think also related to that, one of the things that I walk people through, regardless of whether they're working with us individually or in the group, is to really understand, how is it presenting for you? How is the fear of public speaking anxiety? How is it manifesting for you? So what I want to say is that for some people, it's a shortness of breath, and for some people, it's not. And for some people, so there is a communication anxiety piece to this. And when that's the case, it's really about, for every single person, it's learning to create the ultimate conditions that you really show up at your best. So for some people, Jonathan, this would be things like, I've noticed that meditating for me really helps me to show up as my best. And so I share this with a lot of my clients, that meditating before public speaking, even if the morning before, but I'm not just in stillness when I meditate. It's even things like stretching my arms overhead or doing tongue exercises or vocal warm ups, because that really helps individuals who tend to stutter or have difficulty with enunciation. So there's a lot of different things like that that we tailor to the specific individual. But what I would say is learn about what are the ultimate conditions for you where you really show up at your best and really start to build a public speaking toolkit around that. Other things that I would say, a core thing that really helps people with this is learning to really shift their attention from their self to their audience and their surroundings. So for a lot of people, it would be things like we touched on this earlier, but rather than, are they judging me favorably right now? And am I looking stupid? Which people have these kinds of thoughts. I want you to focus less on like how well are people perceiving me to do they understand what I've said and what are my core messages that I really want to deliver here today. So there's many different strategies like that, Jonathan. I'm happy to delve into some of them specifically, but a lot of them we tailor to the specific person depending on how they're presenting with it. Because the one thing that I've really realized, there are certain symptoms and sensations that do unify a lot of us, but there's also a lot that is highly variable depending on the specific person. It's not like a one size fits all kind of symptom presentation that we're looking at.
Totally. Can we run through a little exercise together? Because I'm curious for myself. And I think, like for me, I know I had an experience last year where I got to speak at Society of Human Resource Managers in Orlando. And in that room, you have in that conference, actually, you have all sorts of different HR professionals. And I'm coming from a very not corporate world. And this was my first conference presentation as such. I planned, I did all of the things. And at that conference, I thought maybe I'd get 2 people in the room because why do people want to hear from me? And then I walk into that room. It was right after lunch on the last day of the conference. And there were over 300 people in this room. And I am a very just generally socially anxious person. But I see all of these people in the room and I'm already starting to melt down a little bit. But I'm going on stage in 5 minutes. I start to go on stage. I start running through my material. Some of it is, very presentation style, but I also have an interactive component. And, that requires me to go around the room with a microphone. Ahead of this, I start stuttering. That's one of the things that happens when I get anxious. And I immediately start, oh no, I stuttered. And I'm just saying that into the microphone. How do I take time to notice, all right, I know that some of these behaviors are going to be present. I can do all of the things to, those low-hanging fruits that you mentioned before, not have coffee early in the morning, all of those pieces. But when you're in the moment, when the stuttering is happening, when you start to feel your anxiety rise, when you're presenting, what are some of the things that you can do to sort of course correct?
I think this is a really great example. And I love that you kind of gave this as a really, this is one that you've experienced recently in the last year or two, because I think that there's a lot we can speak to with regards to this one. I have some questions back for you first, though. Please. One of my first questions for you is, did you set an intention for yourself before going into this conference presentation? Did you think about what kind of the value, what were the core messages that you wanted people to derive from your presentation?
Yeah, so this presentation, I really wanted to focus on how leaders can better support their millennial employees. So that was the focus of the presentation.
Okay, so my next question for you would be, how did you want people to feel in the room? Did you want them to feel engaged, inspired, informed, intrigued? What word would you use to describe how you would want people to feel? Is it supported? What word if you can think of that you would feel?
Engaged. I wanted to say things, and I wanted my desire was to look into the audience and see people being like, oh, cool, I have a question about that.
Yeah. So I think that part of this starts before you get there, is what I'm already starting to kind of touch on here, is that setting an intention for how you want people to feel. So one of my favorite things to say to people is that it's not what you say, it's how you make people feel, right? So by you even starting from this place of when you're building your conference presentation to be I want people to feel engaged. I want people to feel engaged. How can I do this? I think that even in those kinds of ways, in moments like this, we can try to cultivate feelings of excitement. And so even from like the days, the months leading up to it, that might even help going forward, just so you can kind of really think about how, like, I'm so excited for this thing because here are all the things I plan to try to make them engage. I have a poll planned. I have like some questions I'm going to ask the audience to kind of get them to share on the spot. Like, really think about, if I want to make my audience feel engaged, how am I going to do that? And kind of be like, come at it from that really curious perspective. So I think that that's even part of it. A second thing, I have another follow-up question for you. Is it sounds like this is the case, but was your heart racing?
Oh, absolutely. And quite honestly, after the presentation, people came up and congratulated me and whatever, but I cannot remember anything that happened during that presentation at all. Almost like had a blacked out experience in that way. I obviously presented everything, but I was maybe on like fight or flight autopilot type of vibe.
That is a really common experience for most people. And because sometimes like the fight or flight response and the adrenals are running on kind of oversupply, it results in those kinds of feelings of disassociation and not remembering what happened or what you said. But what I wanted to talk about specifically with respect to the heart beating is actually, I'm going to borrow something from Taylor Swift, and I call it the heartbeat exercise. And I don't know if you know this, but do you happen to know, Jonathan, how Taylor Swift prepared for her Eras concert using a treadmill? Do you happen to know anything about this?
I don't know anything about this, but I'm very familiar with the Eras tour.
And you're very familiar with Taylor Swift too, right?
Very familiar. You
At the
can
time,
be at this point, I feel.
yeah, I mean, we're talking. So I feel like the city of Toronto is still shaken from her being here a few weeks ago, a couple weeks ago. But what I want to share with you actually is a really brilliant way that she prepared for the Eras tour that she's talked about, which is that because the concert is like 3 hours, she ran on a treadmill at a fast rate during her upbeat songs. Have you heard this? I'm assuming you had not now. Maybe you've heard of this. But during the slower songs, she would have like a light jog because she wanted to also see whether, like, with the stamina and kind of getting practice with singing at that elevated heart rate. How did this apply to public speaking? So this is actually a strategy that has worked for a lot of my clients who tend to get that elevated heart rate. Is that I have them practice their presentation before going into it with a heart rate that they can expect on the day of. So it would be, for example, you trying to spend 5 minutes, do all the burpees and jumping jacks and push-ups that you can to try to get that heart rate up really high, then practice your opening, because that's how you can actually expect. So maybe if you were practicing the stutter before, like, it just, that moment of just saying, these are the conditions, because we even know, like, with like athletes, that they'll practice in environments that are less ideal, or they try to also mimic the environment that they're likely going to experience on the actual day. So it's also about applying that philosophy here. So I usually have people practice it once at like a very high BPM, like a heart rate BPM of like 160 to 170. And then maybe once like around moderate, around 120, 130, and then doing something below 100 just to see
I
like what is the difference.
I guess that feeling and part of the strategy here is that the second that you're actually presenting and you're starting to feel that really elevated heart rate, like, I know for myself, my brain just starts naturally to do a whole bunch of different things. But if I practice it ahead of time, my body can kind of know what to expect.
Exactly. So it's almost like, I just did this yesterday. I did this with an elevated heart rate. I can do this right now. So I find that that is one that helps a lot of people. So it's, you have a chance to work through it and you have that exposure to that elevated heart rate. And the goal is that you can say, no, I did it even though my voice was shaking. I did it even though my heart rate was more elevated. So those are some things I wanted to share. Other things I wanted to share would be grounding. So grounding is a really common strategy that's used in psychology to kind of help people that are feeling that they're not being present to kind of bring them back into a present space or back into the room. And as I've mentioned to people, even with public speaking anxiety, one of the things that they struggle with is that we're not always as immersed into our surroundings. We're having like the self-focused attention moment, and like we feel like we're not really connecting with other people. So grounding can be a way to kind of help you slow down the thoughts a little bit and root back into your experience in the room. So what grounding is for people who are listening, it would be an example of this would be either focusing on all of your five senses or just even picking one of them. Because again, it's right before public speaking. How much of an opportunity do you have to sit there for like 6 minutes and go through your five senses, right? So maybe for you, it would just be like, what are five things I see in the room? And just kind of listing those. Maybe it's like, what are five things that I hear right now? Or maybe again, you focus on one of those sensations or one of those senses versus all of them. But even something like, what do I feel right now? And even kind of practicing noticing your elevated heart rate and just being like, I notice my heart is beating faster versus my heart is racing. Like the whole idea is like you're being more neutral and just what are you observing versus trying to assign meaning to it.
It's different being in that room where you're like, for me, my mind is quickly going to, great, all these 300 people are in the room, they're judging me, they're expecting all of these things. But through grounding, I can say, oh, I noticed that person over there, they got really cool glasses. And by noticing neutral things, it can help to start to regulate.
Love that. I love the way you explained it. I love that. And I was even going to say too, the one other thing we know is I would kind of put this under low hanging file that's a little bit under low hanging fruit is, but something that may not seem as obvious sometimes is rapport building. So we know that rapport building, and what I mean by that could even be just connecting with someone else in that room before your presentation and just having that moment just to be able to exchange a smile with somebody to have lock that friendly warm eye contact with somebody else. Those little ways can also just tell our nervous system it's okay, these are people just like me, versus like this is like this big audience and getting caught up in numbers. Just that brief moments of connection like that can really do wonders for our nervous system.
It's fantastic. It sounds like mindset really plays a role. There could be that underlying, like in my case, and I'm sure for many other people too, there can be that underlying pre-existing piece of having anxiety. But in that moment, there's a lot of different tools like grounding, like rapport building that we can use to sort of get our mind to a healthier place to be successful in the presentation.
Totally. And I think that even part of the part we talked about first is even just around how am I preparing for this presentation in the days and weeks before, and even practicing mindfulness on a daily basis and not being as attached to thoughts sometimes when they come up is it's also part of the pre-speaking presentation prep, right? So it's learning to even speak more gently to yourself, more compassionately all the days of the year versus just trying to cram right before a presentation and kind of expecting I'm just going to start telling myself I can do it the day before. It's really how do we speak to ourselves all the days of the year?
You can't just run a marathon. You have to prepare for the marathon.
Exactly. And it really it's a skill, like learning to unhook from negative thoughts, learning to detach, learning just to observe thoughts. And because I think that even in that moment with public speaking, it's also it it's not the time to start practicing detachment. Like you have to practice it in other environments where you're not feeling the fight or flight response as heavily.
Yeah, you have to practice all of the tools. That way, in that moment, let's say detachment is something that you find works really well for you, you can autopilot and say, all right, like I'm going to practice this technique now and it'll work. You don't have to go through all the thinking and processing of it as well.
This is one other thing I just want to drop too for any of
Please.
the listeners here, Jonathan. It may not have worked in your situation, but for a lot of people, when they're feeling tension in the body, I want them to actually engage in movement to let it go, whether it's like sighs, like an audible sigh of going, like just having that moment just to kind of let it go, or even shaking or doing like a happy dance on the spot. I don't know if you had a room that you were in prior to this or not, but like finding little ways to just kind of like even something as simple as like doing tense release kind of exercises in the body where no one knows it. Little ways like that too can just help relieve any kind of strange tension or stress in the body.
That push, pull, squeeze, and all of that.
You got it. Yeah.
Fantastic. What advice would you give to someone who's just starting their journey to conquer public speaking anxiety? Are there steps they can take? How can they celebrate their progress incrementally over time?
So what I would say is start with finding topics that you're passionate about. And when you can kind of focus on some topics or messages that you want to share, it will help you to kind of trump the fear just by saying, you know what, my purpose is more important here. My purpose of sharing this message is more important than dealing with this fear. So sometimes it just helps us by finding topics that we're really passionate about. I would also say to start small with everyday situations, whether it's leaving a voicemail with somebody, whether it's telling a story to a group of your friends. Like look for whether it's giving a toast at a holiday or family dinner. Look for everyday opportunities, even if it just evokes a little bit of anxiety, even like a 2 out of 10. So I would say look for some of those. And I think that also we're really clever at talking ourselves out of public speaking opportunities. So, for example, like if someone said to me, "I want to be on a podcast," but I don't have any access to people that do podcasts. Like, I have really good ideas around. Oh, actually, I know some like free distribution lists where you can actually get on to be able to find some of those opportunities. So being aware of how we talk ourselves out of those opportunities, I would also say it's important to be aware of it because there are opportunities everywhere if we really just look for them. And I would say also around reading books, and really starting to listen to other podcasts where people are describing some of these strategies that they can also use would also be helpful to someone who's just starting off. So like books like Find Your Voice by Carolyn Goiter, or I think it's called by Viv Grosskopf. It's called How to Own the Room is another one that comes to mind. In the Spotlight by Janet Esposito. Pressure to Perform is another one by Dr. Carrie Evans. There's lots of examples of these books out there, and it can just be a helpful start to kind of start to learn about how do you experience this and how do you want to start to adjust how you're reacting differently to the situations.
One of the things that I really try to do when I read a book or I listen to a podcast or I watch somebody present is I'm like, oh, I really like the way that they did that. I thought that was really engaging. It brings me closer to the thing that I want to have in that presentation. And then the next time I do it, I try it on, like kind of like going to Old Navy and finding a new plaid to see if brown is really your color in this case. After I have that presentation, how did that one new variable feel? Did having that check in at the beginning of a presentation really make the room feel at ease and help with my presenting? Or did it put people on edge because I wasn't being direct enough? Having those variables to test has been really, really helpful.
Like that you said variables to test because the way you're kind of describing it is almost as like an experiment. And we know that even in psychology, by trying to have a more curious, inquisitive mindset, it helps us to detach from a problem just by being able to say, like, versus what I mean by attachment and detachment is that sometimes, for example, with public speaking anxiety, people get really caught up in the thought and will say, I'm so anxious, I am so this, I am so that. And then all of a sudden they are their experience. Whereas detachment would look like, for example, it would be, I am noticing some feelings of anxiety right now, or I'm noticing my heart is beating faster, but not getting caught up in the actual thought itself and believing the thought. So just like I'm noticing right now, for example, I'm having that thought. So I really like what you said about experimenting because it really helps to create this inquisitive mindset. And it's also about being a student of public speaking in every opportunity that you have. Like whether you just love the way that one person opened their presentation, you love the way someone, had their pacing during certain slides, a question that they asked, whatever it is. It's like every single time that I listen to someone else on a podcast, I'm always like, oh, I love the way that they explain that. Or I love the way that they used a really good pause, or their impact words were really strong. Like I'm noticing little things like that every single time that I'm listening to a new podcast or a presentation, or just being in someone's team meeting even. It doesn't have to be a presentation all the time.
I love that. And you've been crushing it today. So thank you so much, Amanda. This was really, really, really great. Um, if you have one piece of advice for our listeners around starting their own journey with maybe public speaking, anxiety, or mental health more broadly, what would you share with them?
I'd say to think about it like Project Self, and to really think about yourself as a lifelong project, and trying to make the choice to enjoy that learning and that project. And whether it's someone who's experiencing public speaking anxiety, we work with a lot of individuals at my practice as well. They're navigating career changes. A big part of this can be a more enjoyable experience if we kind of try to enjoy it. I'm not saying every single day you're going to enjoy it, but really making that effort to do that. And one of the things I've actually spoken about before also is that I navigated a pretty big career change for myself in my early 30s. And one of the things that I don't know why and can't remember the exact day, but I made this choice to be like, if you're gonna look into navigating this career change, enjoy the process. Like the minute I stop enjoying this, like this is not how I'm gonna go about doing it. This is not gonna be my approach. So I think that it's really important to just kind of recognize sometimes our attitude towards things can really extend and prolong a journey and make it a lot more painful versus trying to even enjoy learning about psychology. So a lot of my clients are people that love learning about like personal development books and kind of the self-help aisle at Indigo. And I just find that those kinds of individuals that are like sharing with me the books they're reading and what they're learning about, they're engaging with and reflecting on how it applies to them every single day. So I like the term Project Self, and just kind of seeing this as like, one of the best projects that you can invest in, and that it's really a lifelong journey.
That's really, really great. So it sounds like there's a lot of different ways to connect. Um, there's everything from therapy and experiencing that piece of it, but it can also be something as, in quotes for those just listening, small as reading a book and starting to engage in that practice.
Absolutely. And I just also want to put it out there for anyone listening that they're welcome to connect with me on either Instagram or on LinkedIn, and share with me, sometimes your thoughts around blog posts that we've written or any ideas. Like I love hearing from people saying that, like, I listened to the 5 FAQs podcasts, and like, this is what I really learned from it. Like things like that, or here's some questions that I have for you, or where can we go to learn more about this? Like those kinds of conversations I really enjoy, and really find it fulfilling to hear from people. So they're always welcome to connect with me. And if they are based in Ontario, they are also welcome to kind of find out whether our services are something that they can benefit from. And so they're also welcome to send us an email at hello@amandatobepsychology.com to Jonathan. I just wanted to share that for any listeners. They're welcome to get in touch and find out if that's something that they would benefit from.
Love that. And we encourage you all to get in touch with Dr. Tobe to learn a bit more about what we do as well. You can learn more about our inpatient treatment and virtual treatment programs at ehncanada.com to listen to even more episodes of the 5FAQs podcast with fabulous leaders. You can check it out on your favorite streaming platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, we're everywhere. And Dr. Tobe, thank you so much. This was amazing. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and to everyone also at the EHN Canada team for having me again.